Welcome to Tea for Three, a podcast where the three of us get to have a conversation with a fourth. Today, our guest has spent a lot of time with us in our government and politics class. He's well-versed in economics, business, and he's an inspiring pianist on the side. Please welcome to the podcast, Danial Hendi.
Hey, Daniel. What's up, Daniel?
Hey, nice to be with you guys.
Yeah, nice to have you, man. What have you been up to?
Great. Well, recent days, school. Guess we've all been in school, right?
Well, we're on break now, so
Very nice, yes.
we should have a couple days of freedom.
Exactly. You guys all done with your college processes?
We're working on it.
Nice.
We got more important things to do, like this
Exactly.
podcast. Anyways, so Daniel, what do you want to talk about today? I mean,
So I guess, we're both in our government and politics class, right? And some interesting developments in here in space news. And I'd say this is really important, and I don't know if you guys would agree, right? This entire climate change dilemma is really hitting us hard. I mean, imagine approaching winter, right? It's Christmas. I heard before coming to Princeton, and by the way, I'm new to Princeton, so beautiful landscape out here, that we'd have feet and feet of snow, right? Well,
I don't
where
see
is
any of that around.
I don't see any of that around. And that really brings to mind this cogent issue, right? Climate change is something that's hitting us all hard. We can all see it around us. And so there's, many different opinions on this. And I guess I'd branch it out to you guys asking, what do you think the solution is?
well, I just want to say I agree with your comment, man. I mean, I love snow, especially when we're coming in this festive season, and it disappoints me every year as it gets less and less and later. But I mean, obviously, I think it's a super important issue that we talk about, and I think especially in New Jersey. Oh, someone's got a call. I think in our New Jersey, our state curriculum, we do end up talking about it a lot, but I think it kind of ends there after awareness,
Yeah.
because
I guess I very much disagree with this alarmist type of thinking that's very unproductive. I think that when we get into looking at real solutions, that's where our focus should be. And as a school, it's very understandable. We're young still. There is no need to be sitting here thinking about existential threats to our society. But there is still, I think, a real need from the young, right? These are the people who are going to be in the workforce. And I say these are the people, obviously. Me, Ion, all my friends back here, these are people that will be enacting this kind of policy change. And, I'd branch it out to you guys. Where are you guys interested in going then?
I'm looking into the policy sphere. So I guess that would lead me to, my question for you, which as a high schooler, do you think it's more important for us when dealing with these kind of existential level threats to analyze it, from the grown-up angle? Are we supposed to look at the economics of climate change, looking at carbon taxes, carbon rebates, how to best stimulate the economy while also providing a solution for climate change? Or should we be more focused on a social angle, how to get our friends mobilized, how to get people recycling, reducing, reusing, things of that nature? Do you think there's a balance to be struck there, or is there a duty for us as high schoolers to, concentrate on one or the other?
I feel like we can both, always do both. And here's my general philosophy of it, right? With this idea of climate change, it's obvious that as an individual person, our impact on the world isn't going to be massive, right? That's pretty much fact. This doesn't mean we need to not recycle and not have these social initiatives, but it is, I guess, commonly accepted that the government and the people really in charge, so to speak, do have, this sort of agency that we as students don't. But I would say that as students, we bring a unique angle, and I think that really comes from our youth and not being inundated by this world of, I guess, politics. Climate change is a very political issue. Being inundated by the idea of solutions that are really outdated, right? Like what applied in the 1970s when our parents, were dealing with this issue, so to speak, is not what affects us as we go into life. And I think that that's a really unique and important angle to look at.
And you mentioned that climate change is, nowadays, I think we all know that it's a very political, very touchy subject, especially in the politics sphere, right?
Exactly.
Do you think it should be like that? Because nowadays you see a lot of arguments back and forth on both sides, on the left and the right, about climate change and the best way to approach it, whether it exists or not, right?
Yeah.
Do you think this is a very effective, efficient way to go about something that could potentially have such a grave impact on the future, like our generation, especially our kids, or us potentially when we're older? Do you think it should be so political, or do you think it should be seen more as a humanities issue?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, there is obviously that faction of climate denialists in the right wing, and I think that those are, accepted by all. We see them. I mean, we don't ridicule them, but we kind of do. I do think that, though, there is a bipartisan wing to this, that at least the acceptance of climate change. I would say there's a very stark divide on what the solutions to achieve climate change are, and I'd also say that, you see this bipartisan issue, but you don't see the kind of unity in the importance of it, like elevating to the importance. True, both parties do admit that there is this, phenomenon as climate change, and both parties are, I do hope, at least observant enough to be able to see around them and understand that the world today does not look like the world it looked in the 1980s, 1990s. But I do think that there is certainly a different level of focus, right? And there is a focus on one side, I won't say, but you obviously can infer what that side is, on the idea of climate change being more of a pressing issue, and this can have its own extremes, right? I can never say that one side has it always correct, right? Because when you take too much importance to a subject, you actually start to detract from things that might have an eventual impact on them. I'm going to draw this example, for example, with climate change. Climate change does sprout from many different policies, right? And sprouts from oil policies, natural gas, and also renewable energy, right? And this is a major focus of both groups. And I think that there is always this idea that if you are too alarmed by something, you will be more alarmed by that thing itself. And this is probably difficult to understand, but it's not just the thing itself. It's every one of the peripheral policies that surround the idea of climate change. And when you have those peripheral policies, and when you focus more on them and more on those aspects that are not directly the issue, it sort of comes to it. And I understand that here this is getting into a big tangent that's really not very understandable and not very clear, but it's the same with all of these issues, right? All of these issues, there's no real answer, so to speak.
I think one of the issues that, if we ignore the people who don't believe in it for now and just look within the two sides of an argument in terms of a policy perspective, and you guys can correct me because I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I think a common question becomes who's bearing the costs of these initiatives towards a so-called greener environment. And I think that it comes to a lot of government regulations, for example, on if I'm trying to say what kind of power you can use, right? If we're devoting, if we're putting policies on renewable energy sources, obviously it becomes easier for larger businesses to implement, and it becomes more cost efficient on a larger scale. They can bear the cost of changing versus a small business. If you're saying that, hey, your delivery vehicles need to be electric, or you need to start operating your building on 50% solar power or some other sort of renewable energy, where for them they kind of rely on the low costs of natural gas and petrol.
So I think
where's the balance?
So I think one of the things to consider here is that a lot of the starting points for policymaking come to who can bear the costs and who is bearing the costs of these climate policies. So if you think of fracking or renewable business practices, that's who can bear the costs. You bring the example of small businesses versus large corporations being able to do it. But I think the question that should get answered before is who ought to bear the costs, because I know we discuss it a lot in our government and politics class, but does the government have an obligation to bear some of the costs of climate change? Or should the Treasury take out massive loans so that we can invest in green technology? Or are businesses the ones that should be bearing the costs because they create, they stimulate our economy, or things of that nature? So I think before we get into the secondary question, which is absolutely an important question and one that should be answered, of who can bear the costs, I think what we have to think about first is who ought to do that. And just like Daniel was saying, I don't know if there's a clear-cut answer to something like this. Like, everyone on different sides of the aisle is going to have different views, and I think frankly, one of the most embarrassing things is that there's no sense of unity on this issue, even though there's different levels of how important it is. But I think once we come to a sense of unity, and once we can find a bipartisan answer to that question of who ought, then I think it makes solutions a lot easier.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that statement. I think the unity is the most important part of that entire, description. I think the understanding that unity is the solution, right? Without unity, there is really no policy, because it is simply true that in the government we live in, and it's, I guess it's maybe critique of this type of government we live in, but I don't really think it is, because it forces us to reconcile that there has to be shared values, right? And if we don't have that shared value system, no actual change can occur. And I think with the examples of small businesses and large corporations, I think we can look even larger, right? Corporations and the government are, as we say, for the people, by the people, right? They're created by individuals. And if we look more at the individual demographics and looking at it from an economic example, those individual demographics have a massive impact, right, on what kind of can or should be assigned to them. Right, I give the example, maybe, the working class today, right? It's made of, I'd say, the generations, millennial generation, Gen X. And I say that those generations right now have more purchasing power, more buying power in the current economy. And that having that kind of buying power not only gives them a more, valid say in the argument, but also bears the cost on them. I think it cuts both ways, right? And you see that currently in government, and I think this is a question that I'd ask for all of you, we see that our officials are really old, right? I mean, you even look at both sides of that. You see Trump, you see Biden, both in their 80s, both octogenarians, as they say, which is a very interesting term. And I think that raises the question, how much are they invested in our future? Especially because their future is, I hate to say it, but quite limited.
Right.
Yeah. Eventually it's not going to be them making these decisions,
Exactly.
right? It's going to come down to us. And I think we're kind of moving away from policy now when I ask this, but I know that, Daniel, you're very interested in a lot of new technology and businesses that are coming up and around. What's some of your favorite climate change technology and initiatives that you've seen going around?
Well, yeah, I'd definitely say with the aspect of climate change, because all of this new technology is really intertwined. There are two major fields that I want to touch on here. One is in the AI space, and one is in the, off-world exploration, the space, so to speak. And I do think that both of these have gotten a lot of attention recently, especially with both AI and space. I guess I'd bring some, artifacts to reflect this. Firstly, we know that in OpenAI, which is currently, I'd argue, the most leading AI development, artificial intelligence development space today, you saw that its CEO, there was major turmoil at the company. Its CEO was both, I guess, unceremoniously booted out and then rehired. There was an entire fiasco. And in the space, I gotta have a better word for this, but in the space, you see Elon Musk and what he is doing with the company SpaceX. And I think this has actually vast geopolitical implications, but specifically with climate change, both with artificial intelligence being a major tool that can increase human efficiency, right? We've seen that climate change has been a problem for a while, and we see that solutions to it have come very rarely, if at all. And there's the hope that having a more efficient and more intelligent, intelligence come and provide policy solutions could be very helpful. In the space, there is the idea that, and this is very branching off of the issue of climate change, because apart from that faction of climate denialists, there's also a different faction, and I think this is maybe more valid faction of individuals who believe that climate change is something that is inevitable, and because of its inevitability and the fact that even if we have solutions and even if we can create solutions, those solutions are very likely to be inefficient and very likely to take a long time to implement. We should think abroad, right? We shouldn't rest the entirety of humanity's stake on the fact that several octogenarians in Congress can come up with a solution, right? There is no faith in that. I would say that if you look in the current geopolitical environment, faith in the government is at an all-time low. And so with that lack of faith, there is a major push to look elsewhere, and I think space is the frontier that we haven't explored so far, and I think that there is a major push from especially people in the younger generation to look towords that.
Now, Daniel, you have a bunch of experience in specifically artificial intelligence. You've worked with artificial intelligence for a while now. You have clearly done some research on it, OpenAI and all its turmoil. As a student interested in artificial intelligence, and for so many students around the country that are interested in pursuing artificial intelligence, both in higher education and as a career, what's a word of advice you would give to students who are interested in this field?
Well, I'd say the first word of advice, right, is use it and see and learn why. Because I think that even though there are individuals right now who are very interested in the space of AI and the space of like commercial.
Sorry to break you for just 1 second, Daniel. I'm sorry. Anyone hungry?
I know I am.
Want to grab some bagels?
I'll be right back. Would you like something?
No, I'm fine.
All right, I'll be right back.
We'll see you
Alright.
soon, Matt.
Pick it up around the block.
So, what were we? We were saying, yeah, what's your advice you have to kids?
No, I guess the fact that you have to learn about it. And I think the idea of, ChatGPT, right? We all know ChatGPT. We've all used it in some respects or another, whether legitimately or not legitimately. I think that is a major point to be argued. But I think that, it brings such an idea, right? The potentials of this technology. Obviously, with ChatGPT, there are major downfalls with this technology. It gives fraudulent answers maybe 50% of the time, right? Hopefully less. Ion, you have more experience. You want to attest to that?
No, I mean, I'm a huge fan. I've been a long-time subscriber of ChatGPT Plus. I think that it's very worth it, and the technology has interested me for a while. And I think that, honestly, ChatGPT and OpenAI has just done an incredibly good job of turning our basic functions into a more usable interface. I think OpenAI and ChatGPT has kind of paved the way forward for us to use, and we're not getting rid of it.
I think it's not even the fact, because I guess, would you agree that OpenAI right now and ChatGPT in its current form do have certain flaws and it's not a perfect system yet?
No, of course not.
Of course
Everything's
not,
always developing, yeah.
And not just the fact that it's developing, but the fact that the potential, and we know that artificial intelligence could, and this is the fear of many, that it could actually replace, human life. It could be more intelligent, could be more actually sentient. And I think the question here is that we know the potential, and we know that we are nowhere close to that potential. And so we have to look at what we have today. And I think that what OpenAI really is a pioneer in is the idea of building this space, right? It built the AI space. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I've never interacted with AI. I never researched AI. I never looked at AI before the advent of ChatGPT.
It's funny because I think AI to a lot of people is defined incorrectly, because
Exactly.
most people would think of their Alexas or their Googles or their Siris as AI, but really that's more of a robot where people have programmed each of their responses.
Well, even if you think of ChatGPT, you couldn't at any state of mind call ChatGPT an artificial intelligence.
I think the thing that ChatGPT has kind of changed is its ability to interpret natural language,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah, and I think that humans have such inefficiencies in language, right? If we look any computer coders out there, you know that the idea of taking human speech and human text and turning it into something that a machine, something that a more efficient, intelligence can use, is a very difficult process, and one that requires many years of learning. And I think that, especially in the field of computer software, that OpenAI has and ChatGPT has such a bridge between these two worlds, right? It understands natural language, and yet it is coded and it works in a real machine language environment. And I think having those both sides can help bridge the gap for many who, it's like learning a language, right? The idea of a translator. The translator does the work for you, making it more easy for you to get to the final solution, which is communication with new people. And I think if the goal is software development, and if it is, in fact, the creation of a new truly artificial intelligence, one that is sentient, one that understands itself, and one that can be truly useful to us in real world scenarios, it is really important to have the idea that you have these different systems interlocking.
So, as someone, you guys obviously have used ChatGPT. And you have the new version of ChatGPT.
Yeah.
GPT, are we on 4 or 4.5 now?
4 is the mainstream usable one.
So the mainstream usable one is 4. Everyone else in the free version is using 3.5. So this is kind of a two-part question. One, you were talking about bridging, like being able to, create bridges through artificial intelligence and generative technology. My question to you is, since you have the new version of ChatGPT, and as I understand it, it has a bunch of integrative features. You see picture generation, like through DALL-E or things of that nature, or as you showed me the other day, you're able to, train a bot and, make it yourself and answer questions as if this were me. So
Incredibly cool technology.
yeah, it really is. So my question is, if we're filling in the gaps, like I can obviously go into Google and I can look this up, but if we're filling in the gaps and we're streamlining this technology to a point where it's ultra efficient and we're using it every day of our lives, then how far do we push this technology? Like, is there a breaking point where, hey, this is off limits, or, you know, we shouldn't touch this, this is something that humans can do on their own? Or is it something that we just keep pushing forwards, and then once we hit that boundary, maybe we'll inevitably know, maybe we won't? Or is it something we, figure out along the way, or is it something we should set hard limits on?
I think that as humans, we have the capability to find that limit naturally. And I think that I personally don't think that there's going to be a point where we're going to be like, oh shoot, we've come too far. I think that when we're nearing that line, it's going to become more and more evident, and people will naturally discover that limit. And I think for now, in terms of bridging these technologies to other processes, I wouldn't be afraid of it necessarily taking over parts of your life that you don't want it to. I'd only say that people should be aware of how they're using it and whether it is really the most efficient way to do something, or are you sacrificing something else, right?
Exactly, right? Like, the idea of, let's bring it back to school, right? We're in school and we use ChatGPT for many functions, including those that we probably shouldn't. And the idea of whether you should use ChatGPT, because many would argue that, well, why do you even go to school when a ChatGPT robot can do everything that schoolwork would require for you? And I guess the real question that raises is, what do we need to do to be a competent and functioning society? And this is going to get really philosophical, but there is a statement that you cannot have a carriage when you cannot walk, right? You cannot use a carriage when you cannot walk. I don't think I'm quoting that right exactly.
You have to learn to walk before you can learn to fly, or something.
Exactly. That's another one. And the idea is that if you don't learn to walk, where is the future, right? Of course, artificial intelligence is great, but we are humans and we strive to create the next best thing. And if we don't have the initial tools, creating the next best thing is really, I think, something that's...
So, and the second part of that question was, you are a current subscriber of ChatGPT, right? You pay money for this. So my question is, when it is such, and if we're finding this naturally, that's great. But if it's an integrated part of our lives, as we can all agree, this will be something massive. It'll have massive implications and potentially ramifications for how we function as a society and day-to-day lives. So if it's something, and I'll take this to an absolute extreme just for the sake of the point, but if it's something that's integrated into our lives as much as, walking or flying or, driving would be, then if it's a subscription-based artificial intelligence where, you have to pay money for it, and if we're talking about like the access of it is only limited to a couple people that can afford the artificial intelligence, is it detrimental for the people that don't have access to this or can't pay for artificial intelligence? Or is it something like you can do all your normal functions without AI, but everyone has a little bit of a leg up on you? Or do you think it's going to be such a big gap that, the people without AI are just left behind?
I think that every sort of technological revolution that we see has this sort of stutter period in which you have this inequality between the wealthy who can afford it or not. I think the reason that ChatGPT and OpenAI has a subscription platform is because it's such a new technology that you're paying for these things that are still developmental, still in beta, right? The Dolly version that I use is the beta version. They have data analysis where you can analyze code, which the free version can't do. That's also in its beta version. And this is still technology people are creating. But as it becomes more streamlined, it's going to become more available. And I'll take an example of like the iPhone. Think about when the iPhone first came out, right? This touch, operated with touch. There's no buttons or anything. And the first iPhone, it's not something that everyone's using. But now fast forward 10 years later, and the vast majority of the population has a phone in their hand. Now it's not an iPhone. Most of the world is operating on Androids. Oh, look.
I'm back.
Great to have you back.
We're talking about, we're full on AI now, and saying that, talking about
what? AI?
AI. I'm trying to talk about the differences in when do people get access to AI. So I think that
that has a continue.
The other example that I used earlier was humane. It's this wearable technology that's you pin to your shirt, and that's something that they do have a separate subscription that's only for data connectivity. But the actual technology itself and the AI is a one-time fee, and I think it's somewhere around like $700 or something like that. And I think that it's funny because it ties exactly to my last example of a phone, because I think it's sort of a replacement for your phone.
Right.
And
this
it's
AI clipped to your chest?
yes, it's essentially a small.
I
you see
completely
that?
agree.
It's like
I
it has a
have heard about
camera,
it, yeah.
and you can use it for everything. You say, "Hey, call this person, text this person." You hold something up. You be like, "Hey, what's this? Add this to my shopping list to remind me to get it later." Things like that.
Yeah.
So this technology, it becomes more directly intertwined in our lives, and it's going to reach a point where it's no longer a subscription model or something only available to a select amount of people, but it becomes normalized that, hey, this is where part of your income is going to go to.
But
this
with
is
the
something that you need
example
to get.
of the phone, then my question would be like, if you look to a developing country where, say a good majority of the population lives in poverty and they don't have access to the phones, is it so hard? Is it hard enough for those populations of people to catch up to, anyone that has access to a phone? If I have everything at my fingertips and, there's people who can't access this technology, is it hard enough for them to catch up? Or do you think there's still like a period where they can develop in society to the point where someone with a phone will?
Well, I mean, I think it's the same as, unfortunately, certain areas or countries in the world will always be not as advanced as others, and I think that's like it's obviously a very unfortunate subject because you talk about this like snowball effect. Once you're behind, you just keep falling further and further behind, whether that be because of things that happened hundreds of years ago or something more recent. But the unfortunate thing about it, I think, is that while people like maybe you or me are in this Princeton, like while there will be these advances, I think that yes, these other places will be falling behind because it will take time, I think, especially something as grand as completely integrating AI into your life. It'll start in more niche places, and I think it will expand, but like everything, it will take time, especially with something as high-tech as it is. Maybe by the time it gets there, it won't be as high-tech. Maybe by then we'll look at it just like Ein said, iPhones. But I think until then, it will take time.
There's actually an interesting phenomenon that connects what you were saying to what Daniel was saying earlier about being able to walk before you can fly. And I don't know if this is, majorly used, but I was learning in one of my classes the other day, there's something with developing countries called technology transfer. And I believe that's the word they use for it, which is a developing country being able to use the newest technology without having first used the prerequisite technology. So I think that's an interesting concept for any developing country or any policymaker thinking about developing countries on how to integrate the necessary technology. And obviously with technology transfer, that term applies broadly to many sectors and it's been used with a bunch of technologies. So I think just analyzing, any consequences or significant events that have happened with that would probably be helpful in considering, how do we catch up?
Yeah. I guess another question we can raise is with the idea of artificial intelligence, you talked about humane being a pin, right? How far can we take integration with the human life, right? What happens, right? I guess the example I would bring is there's a company called Neuralink, right? And I think this is another one of Elon Musk's ventures. Very popular guy. And what he is doing with Neuralink is to integrate the idea of a usable, wearable technology into the person's brain. Okay, and this may sound very Frankenstein and very scary, but I think there's real value to be understood. How much can we integrate until it's too much? And I guess the question I'd raise.
And I think along with that, I think you've kind of paired with that. I saw recently on the news that I'm not sure what company it was, but they were also releasing an AI platform that was adaptive, or you could link to like everything you had online, and then you could make it completely part of your life. And going back to your question of how far is too far, right? Yes. I think that right now we are so worried about that question because of how unfamiliar we are with all these things. We're kind of breaking new ground. I mean, like ChatGPT came out last year, and that was huge, but now everyone's using it. I think that slowly as we progress, when new things come out, there will be that time period, who knows how long that period will be, where everyone will be panicking and saying, is this too much? But I think slowly people will start to get used to it. And I think eventually at some point, who knows how much further down, maybe in a few decades or a few 100 years later, this Neuralink thing will come. And I think upon its first arrival, everyone will be very, very worried and panicked about it. But I think as it happens, as it goes, people will start to become more familiar with it. And I think this question of how far is too far is a ever-changing question.
I think as far as government regulation goes, it's not like the government hasn't had to answer ethical questions before, though. Like, I think that, you know, when concerned with, is this going to divide members across the aisle, and, you know, is how far is too far a subjective question that nobody can answer, I don't think that's necessarily true just in the context of government. So I think while it is definitely like a sensitive subject and should be treated with the utmost importance, I don't think it's I guess to go back to this alarmist rhetoric, I don't think it's alarmist enough to raise the question about government where, like, you know, this is an impossible question to answer. Because if you look to things like, you know, if we had eugenics in the past and there were papers, you know, commending this process, and the government had to impose regulation on it, the medical field has adapted since then, and, you know, they've made big strides. So I think the question of the government answering ethical questions, I think, is a little easier than we think, just because we have a foundation, we've done it before, we've seen it before.
Yeah, I guess another question that I think your commentary springs up is who gets to decide, right? We see that, I guess with the idea of government regulation, it can often be seen as overbearing, and this is another one of the issues that really divides across the aisle. And I guess I just wanted all of your opinions on who at Neuralink, right? Neuralink is a privately funded company. It is not a publicly funded company. And so their owners and their founders and their executive board have real agency over what happens at that company. Should that company be allowed to continue human trials at their current pace? And is there a limit after which the government must intervene for public safety, for the safety of, I'd say, humanity in this case?
Well, yeah, I think definitely. I mean, if you think about it, if you give a private company free reign over something like that for unlimited power, essentially is what you'd be giving them without government regulations, they will be checked by nothing except their ethics and their self. And I think we can agree that at some point there will be companies who will be willing to do things that might not be so ethical for the sake of profits or groundbreaking discoveries.
Would you say the government is more ethical than a private company?
See, that's a tricky question, because
I think perhaps because
I think
we have elected representatives, but I think that's
agree.
the extent of how far I take it. Like, we have people that represent us that, you know, by some way or another were chosen through an election process, and we don't have that same kind of check back for a private firm.
Right.
But I don't know how much more of a distinction I draw between, you know, someone in Elon Musk's power versus someone in Joe Biden's power. Like, is there that much of a distinction? I mean, Elon Musk serves the public just as much as Joe Biden does, right? He's making cars for us. He's creating our future, as we've talked about all of the technologies. Joe Biden is maybe creating that future and regulating it. But I think the only really stark difference is how they're chosen to represent us. I don't think Elon Musk was chosen as, you know, we support him obviously through, you know, buying his products and things of that nature. But I think the question of who should make these decisions is, if it came down to it, sure, the tiebreak I think would be government, just because of, you know, they've been elected. But I think it's a hard question to answer, just because, are we really putting these people in positions of power, or are they getting there by themselves?
I'd argue that the businesses and people like Elon Musk have a larger impact on a global scale. I mean, obviously the United States is one of the biggest players on the international field, and Joe Biden and our Congress certainly has a huge impact on things around the world. But at the end of the day, there are other governments that they also have to deal with, and you have to reach all these agreements and things. And Elon Musk, he has to follow the rules that have been set forth in the United States and in Europe and everywhere else that his companies operate. But I think he has a lot more freedom in that sense to be able to make his decisions more visible throughout.
Right. First thing, does he follow those rules? I think that's a major question that has to be asked. But secondly, I think, and more importantly, it's the idea that, Ishan, as you say, there's a very small distinction, right, between government and private businesses deciding. But there is, and this is just through my experience and research on the economy and businesses in general, the idea that regulation has a massive, massive impact on how a company functions. And now I guess pivot to the space part of this argument with
we
Elon
finally
Musk.
get there.
We finally get there. with the space race and with the company SpaceX, which is, I guess, there is no argument here, right? It is it's a monopoly in the space game. Nobody has even close to the technology they have. With that company, you see the regulation, right? With this recent launch that happened 3 days ago, and for those of you who don't know, SpaceX did launch the largest and most powerful rocket in the world. The rocket that will potentially take us to Mars and the moon. And yeah, I should have said the moon and Mars, but that is besides the point. Anyways, with that company, you see the governmental institution of the FAA, right? The Federal Aviation Administration. And that institution single-handedly has delayed SpaceX's progress for 7 months. And I think that's really creative. I mean, on a larger scale, if we think of how long the development of NASA took, in the space, I think that's considered insignificant. But if you look at what SpaceX is doing and how they've been able to innovate rockets and in 8 years take us from absolutely nothing to being the strongest and most powerful, I guess, space agency in the world, right? Because SpaceX is, again, it's not part of the U.S. government, but it is the subsidiary of the U.S. government. So it cannot act against the U.S.'s interests in, I don't know, for example, selling things to China or selling things to Russia. And so in that regard, we have actually achieved the largest space agency in the world simply through the idea of not having business oversight. And I think that if you draw such a small distinction between the idea of Congress regulating and the idea of businesses self-regulating, is it worth it when you look at the downside, which is that progress can be inhibited massively, right? I'm talking like thousands of percentage points.
Well, I do think that, first, I do think government regulation is needed, even if that means slowing down certain private companies to some extent, because just throwing it out there, my expertise in this area is very limited, but that's
why we're here.
Yeah, that's why we're here though. But let's say SpaceX figured out a groundbreaking way to get to develop all this instead of in 8 years, they found a way to do it in 5, right? Let's say that, and let's say theoretically the government had no regulations on them, but what if what SpaceX was doing was harmful in some ways or had oversights to potentials that could be harmful, not only for people around, but people in the United States as a whole, maybe even globally. Maybe they oversee this, they overlook it because of the potential improvement or potential new discovery of efficiency that they could have. I think that it is still important to have these government regulations, because I think the government's there for a reason, right? It's to make sure that there is some sort of check and balance on these sort of things, and I think without that, it would become unregulated, even unsafe to some extent. And
well, I think we've talked about this extensively, right? The definition of politics, and I don't know, you guys can back me up here on what and you want to officially define politics?
I would like to define politics as a way that Daniel defined it to me a few weeks ago that I really loved, and I remember it very distinctively. Politics is the system by which we slow down change, and it creates friction. It creates friction in our decision-making process, our policy-making process, and through this resistance, it naturally forces us to reconsider all our decisions, to put it through a sort of filtration system, which allows us to better think of its impact, its consequences, and hopefully in that through that process avoid making bad and detrimental decisions. Daniel, you think I did a good job with that?
Yeah, I think I mean, this is being egotistical, but I actually listened to that and I think, damn, that is a good definition. But anyways, back to it. I do think that it is meant to slow down change, and the real, I guess, with SpaceX, the example on the counteracting side, because I think we'd all agree that SpaceX is doing something that is beneficial in this case, and that you're bringing the example. Of course, I understand that some companies may not be. And that is certainly true. With SpaceX, there is the example of worker safety, right? Many workers have actually gotten injured, and when I say injured, I mean graphic here, eyes getting. We understand what we mean by graphic injury. There have been many amputations, many deaths as a result of this, and because of this, I guess it raises the question: how much? And this is a major question, right? Because determines all progress, right? We as a society are able to make incredible progress if we are not inhibited. But we do naturally inhibit ourselves for the specific reason that if we don't, the harm to humanity is far greater than the benefit, right? I guess the example here is nuclear weapons, right? Nuclear weapons was a scientific innovation unlike pretty much anything we have since seen since. I guess you being in the neuroscience field would maybe disagree. Do you have any,
Sorry, just to
relevance?
interject, I think this is a phenomenal point. I was reading an article today that said, is Sam Altman the next Oppenheimer? Just to connect AI to nuclear
Potentially.
weapons if we must.
And if
But-
this gets,
Gilbert? Yeah, sorry. After his food stop, I had to. I was
I
thinking
just
about
thought that
it.
was interesting. I'll let Ian.
I do think that's actually really interesting though, because I mean, now looking in the future from the future perspective, right? You see Oppenheimer as something completely groundbreaking, because I think mostly because we know what his invention could have.
I do want to
could do.
interject because if this goes live and we look back on it in a few years, Oppenheimer was a movie that was released this year, and I think that's important context.
That
to
is,
give.
that is
Good
important.
context.
Why are we talking about Oppenheimer? Yes,
Okay,
because of
and
that.
I
Continue.
think beyond that, I mean, the reason why I think we compare him like that now is because we know what he did and how big of an impact that was. Obviously, right now we don't know where this AI stuff is leading, right? And I actually really like that comparison between Sam Altman and Oppenheimer, because this could potentially change all of our lives and even just the way humanity functions. And I think that's like extremely interesting. But then that also brings up the question, now that we look back at Oppenheimer, we can see how obviously completely life-changing what he did was, and how, to some extent, how dangerous all that was. Do you think it's worth it now to see this comparison between Sam Altman, AI, and Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb? And do you think that we should increase our regulations on that now that we can see this comparison, like learning from history almost to some sense? Obviously it's different,
I
but I think it's more...
Yeah, I think that nuclear weapons, obviously the famous Oppenheimer quote that we always talk about is, "I've become death, the destroyer of worlds."
Yeah,
right?
not that.
Right.
Perhaps not. But I think that nuclear weapons served as such a potential for disaster that it sort of created the opposite. This is something that I remember discussing. I had the opportunity to talk to, before he passed away, Freeman Dyson, who is another famous physicist who worked with Oppenheimer and contributed to the, not directly on the Manhattan Project, but he was definitely involved in that area. And he was also telling me that the nuclear bomb served as a deterrent for sort of all the war and that could have happened afterwards, right?
Sure. Mutually assured destruction has been one of the greatest protectors of peace, I'd say, since the Cold War.
Exactly.
I mean, especially in the Cold War. Sorry.
And I don't think AI has come to an extreme point where we're facing this sort of Will Smith, iRobot type.
Right. But
Great movie,
disaster.
by the way.
Phenomenal movie.
Speaking of Oppenheimer and iRobot, like,
Yeah.
mad respect to those guys.
Yeah. And I think that we're still far away from that, but I think
But
more,
do you think
even
that
more
we
than
should
the-
take steps now before we have to get to that point where it is a potentially fatal problem?
I think we are, because if you think about it, the nuclear bomb, who knew that was going to be a thing, right? If you ask someone realistically,
Exactly,
you can
right.
imagine a giant explosion, right? Anyone could. But until the nuclear bomb was actually created, I wouldn't say that the people were generally very scared of that, and it wasn't a very realistic fear for them. But AI, you see that everyone's sort of ahead of the curve, and everyone's been saying for years, even though AI has been sort of accelerated even more rapidly in the
I
past
see.
year
So
or
are
2
you
years or
saying
so.
it's already more integrated into our society?
Yeah,
since
I
that?
mean, with the nuclear bomb, like, I understand in the Cold War there was this major alarmism and fear of nuclear weapons. I mean, in our today's environment.
Even today, yeah.
Oppenheimer was like a reminder of nuclear weapons.
Right,
We
right,
had
exactly,
forgotten
yeah.
what
Almost,
nuclear weapons were,
exactly.
especially in our generation. I mean, who cares about nuclear weapons when they haven't been used for what is it now? 60s, 70s,
It's sort of
80
we
years.
probably can't even imagine how
Exactly.
catastrophic they are. Like
Right.
in theory, we understand it, but it's not a realistic fear.
Until you actually.
I think
But to
there's-
be
there's
fair,
this
I think we
distinction.
know, like, I mean, to simplify it down to bare bones, right? You talk about, yes, I can imagine a giant explosion, and, the consequences of a giant explosion in my head are, yeah, people are going to die. Like, they had the basis before that, like, any firearm injuries or things of that nature would probably, give you a pretty good sense of, yeah, this is what a giant explosion does. I think the problem with artificial intelligence is I don't know if everyone knows what they're afraid of with artificial intelligence.
Exactly.
I think they're
Yeah.
afraid in general, like what we were talking about before, like integration going super far. Like if I put, if there's AI chips in my brain or something like that, what's that doing to me, right? I don't know what I'm afraid of.
Normalization, right? At some point, AI chips in our brain sounds scary today, but it might be normalized 50 years from now. Who knows?
Exactly.
That's what I completely agree with that, because as the times change, we will start getting more and more integrated to these newer and newer things, and I think it will just become the norm at some point, right?
Yeah. But as the norm progresses, I think when obviously we keep going back to this idea of regulation. How do you create
Right.
policy?
Mm-hmm.
Creating policy on nuclear weapons seems not that hard, and I might be overstepping here, but
Yeah.
if I, simplifying it, giant explosion kills people, bad, don't do it.
Right.
No,
Artificial intelligence, way more multifaceted, right? Like AI chip in your brain, but we don't know the exact impacts of this, right? That could have branched impacts, like the chips, they hurt your brain or they have negative health
even bad?
consequences.
I think-
Is it even bad? Do they have an impact at all? Is that like, I feel as if, the alarmism that goes around when talking about artificial intelligence, and I guess like the iRobot movie that we were talking about is maybe one of the only examples of, robots take over the world and Terminator, right. Robots take over the world, they kill people. That may be one of the only realistic fears, if it is realistic at all. That's the only tangible fear that I think people are talking about or can materialize.
But I don't think that the fear necessarily has to be realistic to create the policy that we need. Because I'd sort of argue the opposite, that with the nuclear bomb, even the creators of the bomb, and you'd look at Oppenheimer and the other people on the Manhattan Project, until their tests were successful and it was even used in war, a lot of them after that point decided to dedicate a huge portion of their lives to working on these policies and trying to bring awareness to the possible consequences, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that even as the creators, they didn't understand the extent to which their creation is able to affect the world. Whereas
No one knew.
Whereas for
Right.
AI, I think that people often overestimate it, right? I think that if you were to take the average American, I think in Princeton, the people that we interact with tend to be overly educated at times and a lot more well-researched on this. But I think if you were to take the average person and ask them about AI and stuff, I think that even those small pop culture references have molded their sense of artificial intelligence enough that their natural instinct has become that, hey, I'm scared of
inflated
this.
fear.
Also,
I
We
don't
don't
like
even-
this.
yeah.
I don't want to be involved.
I guess the real question this raises is how our, our fiction, our media influences our reality, right? And I guess the idea of iRobot is a really cogent one. Here's the example I'd make, right? With the idea of physics and the idea of space travel, right? We've always had this vision in movies and such that we can travel to distant galaxies, right? This is just like a
Star
theme,
Wars,
Star
Wars,
exactly,
Star
Star
Trek.
Wars. At that point, the physics that we know today, the fact that we literally cannot travel faster than a certain speed, which is the speed of light, which while it may seem incredibly fast to us on Earth, is actually nothing, basically, in the microchasms of space, right? It would take 15 billion years, 13 billion years to traverse the universe with achieving that speed of light. So I think that reality doesn't even equate even close to what our fiction represents. And I think this idea of a sentient artificial intelligence must be checked with further research, right? Is it even possible to create a central artificial intelligence, right?
You don't know.
Yeah, there's
You don't know where it
only
goes,
are
though.
Only
so
time can
early.
tell, right?
Yeah.
And I guess we will probably look back on this a few years if it happens or if it doesn't happen and say, we were really stupid to think that, we could ever even guess at what would happen. I think
Hindsight's 20/20.
Yeah.
Maybe
Exactly.
the AI is going to be looking at this and be like, hey, these guys are stupid.
What
and
were
we're
these
thinking
guys
about it.
thinking?
Exactly. But I guess there's really just no way to know, right? And we
Exactly.
just have to go along with it. And
which is why I think regulation at this stage is maybe a bit
Right.
premature.
I think that I would agree with that statement, that I think regulation might be premature here because there's still so much room for us to figure out which direction it's even heading in.
What you're regulating, right?
But exactly, but I would say that the fears that people have tends to be a good thing, because just like how we define politics, these fears are the friction to the change in the wrong direction.
I agree.
Because you have
Yeah.
people who don't understand the technology, like you're saying, about these chips. We don't know if it's bad, but if you ask the average person, they don't want a chip inside their head. And I think that
Very
just
true.
that fear and that opposition to it will lead to people being more hesitant, and therefore getting us to refine it, make it more available to the public, knowledge available to the public before we start moving this direction.
Yeah, and I think, well, I guess just to kind of wrap it up, right? One of the only things we can hope for in the future is, I guess not a lot of people are usually hoping for this, but when you think about it more deeply, as we just did, I think that, let's hope for a little friction in government. Let's hope for some pushback. Let's slow down this process and really think through what we're doing, because as you said, Ian, there is a time and a place for regulation. We don't know if that's right now. Humans can find their natural boundaries, and with artificial intelligence specifically, or if we bring it broader to space technology, all of the things we've discussed today, I think that a friction-full political process would ultimately be, if no solutions arise, then I think a friction-full political process is the one thing we can hope for.
Right.
That we can rely on and we can sort of count on. And I think a lot of people point to government and the political atmosphere and say that, hey, we're so divided. But I think that divide is necessary at times so that we can see both sides, because not everyone is always going to be able to.
Yeah.
So I think I have a lot of trust in our government and society, the way that we've sort of built it out. And I think that while there's that sort of friction and that, I think turmoil is an extreme way to describe
Right.
it. But that clash of ideas, but I think that that's naturally the way that we move forward in a good direction.
I think that anything that we do have to be unified on to survive, we are unified on, right? There are
Right.
certain instincts in the human race that we have, like to protect our own, okay, to not kill our own, which is why we frown on murder.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, that's why.
Oh my god.
I thought I was all good.
I mean, even the fact that you think that, like, it's such a crazy idea to say that we think murder is bad, but how do we come to that, right? You have to think,
Right.
like,
Yeah.
from an outside perspective, how do we even come to this idea that murder is so bad that we can't even, like, think about
We
it,
can
right?
barely discuss
You
it.
can even
sometimes.
barely...
Yeah.
But it's all because of that instinct, right? And I think that instinct is something that unifies us. And I think moving forward, we will have to develop new instincts, especially because we're going into uncharted fields. Like, for example, if we go into space, right? What is in space is not what is here. We are going to have to create new instincts. We're going to have to adapt to our environment. But I think that, again, as all of you have said here, we are in a place to do that, right? We have achieved so much, and we have so much more to achieve. It's all about taking those first steps and taking them with a unified stance.
Well said.
Well
Well
said.
said.
That's a great way
Way
to wrap it up.
Great.
Well,
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you,
Daniel.
Daniel.
It's been a lot of fun
It's
having you on
great.
the podcast today.
we're so glad you joined us, and see all of you next time on T for 3.
See you like this.
All right.